don't talk too well. When Deborah asked me to do this, I was like, why me? And she said, well, because you know him.
Yeah.
You have his fabric, and it's true. If I've not met you, I have the shop next door, and I have seen thousands and thousands of bolts of his fabric. And as you know, there are countless designs. There are also countless ways to pronounce his name. Just yesterday, I heard, I wanted to write them down because they're so varied, but I heard Kaffe Fassett, Kaffe Fassett, and Kaffe Fassett. So I'm going to help you remember, it's safe asset. Kaffe Fassett, safe asset. And his partner slash spouse, Brandon, it's another one. Madly. It's like madly, just change the consonant to a B, madly. Anyway, I apologize for having these notes, but in going through what I know about him or what I wanted to know, I found a lot of quotes. He's the second of 5 children. He was born in 1937, so he's actually now 86, soon to be 87. The 85 is marketing for his line. His real name that he was born with, believe it or not, I didn't know this, is Frank Kaffe Fassett. And when he was a little boy, somebody gave him a book, a children's book, about an Egyptian boy named Kaffe. And he said, that's going to be my name. And from, I think, age 7, and I don't know how they did it, but he's now Kaffe instead of Frank. The book was Boy of the Pyramid by Ruth Jones. He comes from a pretty fancy family. His great-grandfather was a congressman and opened the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, California. His mother and father bought the home of Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth. At 19, he won a full scholarship to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School and lasted 3 months. He said, this was not for me. And at 19, he took off and he went to Europe. So he didn't really know what to do. He knew that he liked painting, and he said that I am European. I'm going to live a European lifestyle. And so he moved to London. And he tried his hand at painting for quite a while. And to subsidize that, he happened to be very handsome as a young man, so he also did modeling. His first venture into our world was he met a guy named, Bill Gibbs, who was a young guy himself who was designing women's clothes in Scotland. He was up and coming, also kind of living the bohemian lifestyle. And he invited Kaffe to go with him to a fabric mill in Scotland. So they got on the train, they went to Scotland, and they toured this mill, and Kaffe was evidently just blown away by all of the colors and went to the raw product and bought 20 skeins of yarn. He had never knitted before, he was just a painter. And as the story goes, on the way back to London in the train, there was a lady knitting, and he asked her if she would teach him how to knit. So she said, yeah, and he started knitting, and that at age 19 is what started him into our world. He got really good. He collaborated with this guy, Bill Gibbs, and who was also becoming quite famous, and Kaffe was designing clothes for his fashion line. And in 1970, Vogue magazine chose his dress, one of his dresses, as dress of the year and featured it in that magazine. And from there, his textile vision just went crazy. There's lists. I don't know if any have you seen his biography, Glorious Color. It's an amazing book about him it's about this thick. Pictures are beautiful, and it just goes really in depth into his life, his friends. But the list of people, that, even at his early age, that were buying his clothes, I've got a few of them here: Barbra Streisand, Laura McCall, Ali McGraw, Shirley MacLaine, Her Royal Highness Princess Michael of Kent, on and on and on. So with Bill Gibbs, he continued his passion for design. And Bill Gibbs died in 1985. So he needed another vehicle for this and discovered needlepoint. and started needlepointing. Any needlepointers in here? Good, that's how I started too. He was needlepointing, he was taking pieces of tile, some of which he still has at his house now in London, making rag rugs, just anything that he could do to further this love that he had for color. In the 80s, he met the president of Rowan Yarns, who later that was coupled with Westminster Fabrics, and they too recognized his talent, and so he started working with Rowan Yarns, and his first collaboration with them was a garment called the Super Triangle Jacket, and they featured it on the cover of their magazine and sold 7,000 kits in 2 weeks. So we know him now as this fabric genius, but really his start had nothing to do with fabric, and he had no interest in fabric other than it was pretty and it was colorful. Okay, so his first book, Glorious Knitting, is like a big coffee table book. It's got 30 different patterns of needlepoint, and they're really, really beautiful. Second book was written in 1987. I'm sorry, Glorious Knitting was the first book. Glorious Needlepoint came out 2 years later. These books are amazing. They're still available online in resale bookshops. I have them both. And it's interesting, on the 1985 book, on the cover, the back flap cover, all they have to say about him is that he won a scholarship to this art museum school. I mean, that's all they knew about this guy, and he only lasted 3 months. He, in 1985, did a television program. It was a series, I think 6 series, and during the course of that program, he invited people to encourage themselves, if they had any interest in this, to design a needlepoint piece that was 6 by 6 inches and send it in of anything, whatever their favorite thing was. He got 2,600 completed entries. And those pieces were put together and exhibited at Chatsworth House and Harewood House, and those are both pretty fancy palaces of the UK. And let's see, he started doing costumes for the Shakespeare Society. He did some costumes for a ballet in Japan, and there was a museum that was open, and they said, can we borrow your costumes to stage the opening of this museum? And he said, sure, but I need them back. And they said, okay. Well, the line was so long and so many people tried to get in to see him that they had to restage it 3 times. In just those 3 days, 107,000 people came to see his beautiful, beautiful clothes. So after that, he was like, what am I gonna do now? And his friend Liza Lucy came onto the scene. And she said, and I love this quote, Liza Lucy kept saying to me, you should get into patchwork. I said, that's just cutting up old clothes and sewing them back together. But she said, you're gonna do your own fabric and you're gonna become famous for it. He said, I couldn't see it. She started taking all my knitting ideas and doing all of these pieces as quilts. She would send me blocks. She would say, this is from your blah, 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 blah sweater. And I would say, well, that's okay, but I think it needs a little more of this or a little more of that. And she said, there you are, you're designing patchwork. Ever since then, you know the story. He's now got over 40 books published. He's been publishing with Rowan. He's published Rowan books for knitting, for needlepoint, for quilting. And these 2 books that I mentioned, if you like him at all, you really should try and find them. Some of them you can pick up for $5, $6 from people that don't know who he is. He did let's see, he has this is another thing about Kaffe I didn't know. He linked up with an international charity called the Oxfam charity, which fights inequality to end poverty and injustice. He went to villages in India and Guatemala to work with poverty-stricken weaving and taught people how to make their instead of doing their indigenous weaving, he started introducing the idea of color, which enabled them to sell more of their product and sustain their village. another quote that he has when he was interviewed by someone with the BBC as to why his designs are so distinctive. He said, one thing about my work is that everything is hand painted. I think it's more organic. Fabulous things can be done on computer, but there can be something blind about them. This makes no sense. He said, I also think young people are afraid of color, which is true. It's not just young people that are afraid of color, right? And then he said, take color away from me and I would die. It's absolutely my life's breath. So his travels, and I guess I should back up and say, when I first opened the shop 12 years ago, I was lucky enough that he came and spoke, and he didn't have a place to stay, so he stayed with me. So I got to spend the whole weekend with him. And he is the most humble, amazing guy. And so just in talking, that statement, he said, take color away from me and I would die. And some of you, I was talking to a couple people next door that have taken courses or lectures with him. His whole focus is trying to get people to open up their own creative minds and introduce color, because a lot of people are intimidated by color. And as you can see by the quilts out there, his whole focus is about his unique vision of color. And Deborah, would you repeat what you said to me about when you walked in and the comment that you made about color?
Oh, yes. So I was mentioning to Stephen when he first came to see the exhibit after we had installed it, and I said, you know, I don't know if you see this, but when I look in this direction from the front door, there's this overall arching golden hue in this museum, and it can be cloudy outside and it's sunny inside because of this. And I've never seen that with any of the other exhibits we've had that I have personally seen. But I just love when I walk in the door, even at night, if I come in here in the middle of the night, and I do because I work, but if I come in here in the middle of the night and I turn on the lights, there's this overarching golden hue that is just undeniable. And it's just, to me, it's warm and cozy, and it's just a beautiful way of just kind of enveloping you when you walk in the door.
And now starts my personal side of this program. The reason for that, I think, is that there's a synergy about all of his fabrics. Even though every single one of his designs are different, they all, in one way or another, complement each other. And I guess the only analogy I can make is like with music. There's a composer I like, Sergio Rachmaninoff. Every piece that this man has written is different, but just play two notes and I can instantly tell that it's Rachmaninoff. And I see lots of fabric next door. I mean, we have people come and show me all kinds of fabric, and there's plenty of people that are trying to imitate his fabric, and they don't even come close. And I mean, there's just something about how he puts it together, and it can't be explained, that sets his fabric apart. So in talking with him, and just it's an innate thing for him that most of us don't have. And what I like about him is that he's patient with that. And if you've been to one of his courses, if you've been to one of his lectures, he realizes that we don't all have the gift that he has, and tries to explain it in a way that we can. For example, a lady came in the store with one of his earlier books, and she said, I want to make this quilt. I said, okay. She said, I want to make this quilt just like this. And I said, well, all those fabrics are long gone. And she said, well, then how am I supposed to make the quilt? And I said, well, we're going to pick fabrics that you like that are like this. And then I went on to tell him that the purpose of his book is not for you to copy what he's done. And this is something he always says, use this as a guide. And if it helps, use me as a guide as to how I have done this, but put yourself in it, because you're going to be spending a lot of time doing this. And she said, you can do that? And I said, yeah, you can do it. So I said, for example, this is orange, right? And she said, well, yes. And I said, well, then let's go find an orange that you like. So little by little, we built her quilt, and she's come back numerous times and said, that was just the most amazing thing. And I said, well, it wasn't me. It was him. And so what you did was you took his design, his suggestions, and created your own quilt. So when he's at my house, he's sitting there. Somebody with needlepoint, you know, when you buy a needlepoint canvas, it's been painted or stamped in some way. He was sitting there needlepointing, and I looked over, and it was a blank canvas. There was nothing printed on it, and 3/4 of it was done. And in these books, you can see examples of his needlepoint work. It was just this spectacular, something like this, just spectacular, and it was just coming from here into his hand, and he was doing it. Could I ever do that? No, but it inspired me to go a little crazy with needlepoint. By the way, I didn't mention this, but early on, another company that he collaborated with was a tapestry company in London. And you can still, it's Aram Tapestries. I went online and saw there's plenty of his designs still. If you're interested in making a Kaffe tapestry, you can get a tapestry kit from London. Now Deborah asked me to open it up. If anybody has any thoughts, questions. I do want to talk a little bit about a couple quilts out there, but if anybody has a question, I'd love to hear it. Comments? Okay, who knows about, yes?
I watch a knitting podcast called Fruity Knitting. It's on YouTube, and she has interviewed Kaffe Fassett a couple of times. They're fascinating interviews. He talks about his process.
They're on his website, Glorious Color. There's a little space where they have press, and there's a woman that went to visit him in his home in Northwest London, and it's all about her sitting down and talking to him, where he goes into his passion with color and what color means to him. And when he walks into a room, he doesn't see the room, he just sees what color it is, and then from there he expands. It's a fascinating interview. As is, I'll say it for the third time, that book, his autobiography, is really a wonderful insight into his life. And it wasn't easy. I mean, he came from privilege and decided to chuck it all, and he went to London and had trouble eating for a while, and he thought he was going to make it as a painter. And just by chance, somebody that he invited over to dinner, hopefully to buy one of his paintings, recognized his talent and kind of gave him the shove. I think that's how he met Bill Gibbs. So, you know, the rest is history. He invited me to his house. Unfortunately, I've not been able to go, but in some of these books, especially in those first 2 books, he used his house as the backdrop of the photography. And it's kind of an old musty English stone house that he has put himself into, and it just is alive and vibrant with color, and he's got tapestries hanging, he's got mosaics that he's made, and then all these beautiful pillows and things. And the gift of that to us is that now we can do it, you know, because all of that is in these books. And as he says, there was a lady at the talk that he did for us back here 12 years ago, and she kind of got up in his face when he asked for questions, and she said, you know, this is all fine and good for you, but how about us? How are we supposed to do it? And as only Kaffe can get away with, he looked at her and he said, can you comb your hair by yourself? And she said, yes. He says, well, then you can do this. That's as hard as it is. And that's really abrupt, but it's true. So many people come into the store and they're so intimidated by all of his color, and I hear a lot, well, that's too busy, or that print is just too big. And if you make it next door, I made a quilt that's right, it's the first quilt on the wall, where I used some of his big giant flower prints cut into 3-inch triangles. So what that did, it changed the composition of the tones of those colors. However, the base color, and you'll see, I needed greens, I needed reds, I needed oranges. It still reads as green, even though there's a lot of purple in it, there's a lot of orange in it, but the primary color is green. And the benefit of doing that, as you can see out here, where they've done the same thing in some of these quilts, instead of it just being green, it's not, it's green. There's a lot of movement to it, and there's a lot of colors that accentuate that. Something else I hear, and I brought an example, is there's so many people that say, oh, I can't, they'll want to make a quilt and they can't find the fabric because it's not Kaffe. And I said, well, you don't have to use all of his fabric. Yes, you do. And I still don't understand that, but here's an example of how using, and this is not a solid either, but it's a tonal solid that really pops his color. So depending on what you're wanting to do with the quilt, there's a lot of quilts out here that are strictly using Kaffe without any borders, without any sashing, and it works. Obviously it's beautiful, but depending on the quilt and depending on what you want it to look like, here's another couple examples. Sure. That really accentuates, I think it highlights his fabric to do that. Personal opinion. What else? There was one other thing I wanted to say. So don't be afraid. This is what I like to tell people. And the fun that I get in having this store next door is just helping people find their way. We also sell yarn. And I love to hear, oh, I'm just a beginning knitter, or I'm just a beginning quilter and I'm not very good. Well, who came out of the womb doing this? I mean, it's all a process. And the more that you do it, the better that you get. Some of us, not as fast as others, but the end result, it's rewarding, and you produce something else yourself that's beautiful.
And if you haven't been next door, it's like a candy store for your eyes. So you'll love it. You'll love it.
We do have a lot of Kaffe. So the one thing I wanted, yes ma'am, you had a
Is
question?
he continuing to create and design fabric?
He is, but Brandon is taking over a lot of it. I mean, the poor guy, I really feel sorry for him in that he has a schedule that I sure couldn't do. And he will leave here and he'll fly to Japan, and then his next trip will be in Brazil. And everybody, he's like Jesus, everybody wants to touch his robes and get a little piece of him. And he's so patient with that, which is why when he came here, I was racking my brain where I could take him, you know, that would be up to his standards. And he said, can we just stay here and have a sandwich? And he got to relax and just enjoy. So yeah, he, as you know, he was here for the quilt festival. He's not doing as much, but Brandon's picking up the slack. And Philip Jacobs is still very involved in the Kaffe Fassett Collective, which is their initial group of designers that they started with. So, you know, soon to be 87. Hopefully he's got many, many more years, and hopefully he can enjoy him less, I think. Yes?
Stephen, did they ever bring back any of his old fabric?
They're just starting to do that. They're, and for those of you that don't know this whole process, they will design a piece of fabric. It's usually printed on paper. He designs on cloth, and then they print it on paper. They send it out to all the vendors that take it and bring it and show us. We make a commitment to buy so much. They get an idea of how much they need to produce, and then they produce it. Once it's gone, it's gone. Now there are several, Kaffe is a good example where he has patterns and designs that he will continue to produce until the market dies off. Some of the older fabrics that people have asked for, they are starting to reprint and come back. Something that Kaffe does that very few people do, and there's 3 examples of it out here, and I hope you get to take a look at it. It's the process of what's called shot cotton. And most of this fabric is printed on a blank piece of fabric, which is called gray goods. For some reason, it's actually white, but it's gray. And they'll take this fabric, and now it's being done digitally, but in the old days, they would press it in a vat of purple, and then they'd move this whole giant long roll. It was a continuous process. Press it in the second color, third color, and it could be as many as 25 different colors, this process. For that to happen, that fabric was woven very, very tightly, very, very rigid. What the difference is with shot cotton is that on a loom, there's strings that go this way called warp, and there's strings that go this way called weft. Well, what he did was he put 2 different colors together. The warp is one color, the weft is another color, and they're usually very close, but just enough different so that it gave it movement. And actually it was, what's it called, cassetta and then backgammon that were done. On the backgammon, there's big pieces of it.
And it's a stroll?
Yeah, if everybody, does anybody else have a question? Because I'd like to point that out. And I was asked, what's my favorite quilt here? They're all beautiful, but the one that I appreciated, and I'll show you when we get to it, for the just workmanship of it, and it's one of the ones with shot cotton.